All right, so we're also just going to do a quick review. We're almost done with the lecture. We just have like one more little section, just a quick review of the other endocrine functions of the kidney. The stuff that we just went over is mostly the highest yield when it comes to the renal system, but the kidneys are pretty diverse and they have some other functions that I think are worth mentioning. So one hormone in your body that's part of another system that acts on the kidneys is calcitonin. Calcitonin is a hormone that is secreted by the thyroid that helps lower blood calcium levels by multiple mechanisms, the scope of which is outside of this lecture. But what you do have to know is that it's secreted by the C cells in the thyroid when blood calcium levels are too high. So there are specialized cells. We know that the thyroid controls metabolism as well, but there are specialized cells known as C cells in the thyroid. And when blood calcium levels are too high, these C cells, they secrete calcitonin. So there are a couple of ways that calcitonin works. You can look to the diagram to the right. Calcium deposition onto the bone, calcium resorption back into the blood. It acts on the small intestines too, but in the scope of this lecture, all I really care about is the kidney and how that works. And it's pretty simple as well, the concept. It just acts on the tubules to inhibit reabsorption of calcium ions. So basically, your nephron would absorb calcium ions normally, and if there's too much in the blood, calcitonin is released, and it tells the kidney to excrete them instead of absorb them back up. That's really all calcitonin has, all the effects calcitonin has on the kidney. Okay. So on the other side of the coin, parathyroid hormone is sort of like an antagonist to calcitonin, or it sort of antagonizes calcitonin in that it has the opposite effect. So it's secreted by the parathyroid gland, and its effect is opposite that of calcitonin. So when blood calcium levels are too low, PTH, parathyroid hormone, is released. So through a number of mechanisms, PTH increases blood calcium levels. And again, we can look to the left if you want. Like I said, I'm going to post these slides, so you can always stop them, study them, and do some of your own independent research based on what you find over here. But it acts on bones. It releases calcium and phosphorus, reduces calcium and vitamin D activation in the kidneys, which is what we're really looking for. It's more so the calcium thing, the vitamin D. I'm not too familiar with it. You can definitely look it up on your own time, but really parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, it's really important to understand the ion flow in terms of both of them. And then it also, again, it has an effect on absorption in the intestines. So just to go back to the bullet points, in the kidneys, PTH has two effects. It blocks the reabsorption of phosphate into the proximal tubule, and it promotes the reabsorption of calcium in the ascending limb of the loop of Henle and the distal tubule and the collecting duct. So it's important to understand also why blocking the reabsorption of phosphate in the proximal tubule helps increase blood calcium levels. So calcium phosphate is the main form of solid calcium in the body. So when calcium and phosphate it precipitates out of solution and it becomes solid. So calcium phosphate is basically what your bones are made of. And in order to get rid of the calcium phosphate and keep the ion concentration high, we have to get rid of the phosphate. So we keep the phosphate out of the blood so it doesn't react with the calcium and take it out of the blood. So without phosphate, calcium is just a free ion, and that increases the calcium concentration. So that's what PTH does in terms of phosphate. And it also promotes the reabsorption just of the calcium ions in the ascending limb, puts them back in the blood. So number two, it actually increases the calcium ion by taking calcium back up. And it also increases free calcium by blocking phosphate from coming into the system. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. All right, and another function of the kidneys worth mentioning is called erythropoiesis. So the kidneys are responsible for the synthesis of red blood cells. So that process is known as erythropoiesis because red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes. So in response to systemic hypoxic condition, hypoxic, hypo meaning low, oxic meaning oxygen, the kidneys synthesize erythropoietin. So this is a response to hypoxic conditions. If we have low hemoglobin levels, if we have low red blood cell count, and we're not getting enough oxygen to our cells, the response is to stimulate the secretion of erythropoietin from the kidneys. And erythropoietin is also sometimes shortened to EPO. So EPO travels to the bone marrow, where, if you remember, is the site of blood cell production, both red and white. It increases the differentiation from progenitor cells, those cells that are coming from stem cells to differentiate. And it basically just directs them to become red blood cells. So as oxygen levels return to normal, EPO levels drop. So it's sort of a pretty good example of a negative feedback loop, and it's a pretty easy one to understand. So oxygen levels go down, erythropoietin levels go up. When erythropoietin levels go up, oxygen levels go up, erythropoietin levels go back down. And it's sort of just like that. I mean, you can take a look over here. Erythropoietin promotes the production of mature red blood cells in the bone marrow. More red blood cells in the circulation lead to increased oxygenation and lower levels of hypoxia-inducible factor, suppressing EPO production. So that's the specific mechanism. You can memorize it if you want. I don't really think it's too high yield or too, too worth it. Okay, then we're coming to the bone marrow. Iron is necessary as well for red blood cell production. Its absorption and transport are also promoted by hypoxia-inducible factor, obviously because iron is a part of heme, and heme helps us carry oxygen throughout our body. And hypoxia-inducible factor, like we just mentioned up at the top, is degraded under conditions of normal oxygen tension. So in anemia or hypoxia, it promotes gene transcription of erythropoietin necessary for maturation of red blood cells. So basically exactly what we just said. They're just adding that extra step. So when hypoxic conditions are induced, this hormone known as hypoxia-inducible factor increases the transcription of erythropoietin from the kidney.